Picture a college campus in autumn, you know the kind. Rolling lawns, giant oak trees, these beautiful red brick cottages nestled away in the woods. It looks perfectly designed for quiet reflection. But we're not looking at a university here. Behind these iron gates sits McLean Hospital, sprawling across what used to be 107 acres in Belmont, Massachusetts. For over 2 centuries, it has been the absolute most exclusive psychiatric institution in America. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack a truly fascinating story. We are going to trace exactly how a noble, democratic medical experiment transformed into America's most luxurious and honestly, sometimes most secretive psychiatric institution.
And really, this brings us to the core paradox we're exploring today. What happens when an institution built to heal the broken-minded becomes a luxury cage for the elite? Like, what does it actually mean when the people who lock you away are the exact same ones who say they love you? To figure that out, we're going to dive deep into the very specific architectural and leadership decisions that fueled this transformation, taking a place of radical healing and turning it into a discreet golden cage for the old money dynasties of Boston.
Now, to really appreciate just how revolutionary McLean was when it first started, we absolutely have to look at the nightmare that came before it. In early America and Europe, the mentally ill were basically just hidden, contained, or outright punished. We're talking about places like Paris's notorious Bicêtre Asylum, where inmates were literally chained to the floors while attendants used whips. It was brutal. Over in some German institutions, patients were lowered into dungeons filled with snakes. The idea was to sort of jolt the mind back to reason. Just horrific stuff. But then, in 1792, a French physician named Philippe Pinel ordered the removal of the chains, and that sparked a completely new, humane philosophy.
And that philosophy was called moral treatment. It was this incredibly radical idea that the mentally ill were human beings in distress, right? Not monsters that needed to be subdued. They believed the mind, just like the body, could actually heal if you just gave it a calm environment, a structured routine, and some basic human dignity. When McLean's original iteration opened up back in 1818 under its first superintendent, Dr. Rufus Wyman, it was built entirely around this compassionate idea. Patients from all walks of life, the poor, the middle class, the ultra-wealthy, they all lived under the exact same roof. For a brief shining moment, it was genuinely democratic.
But as you might guess, that beautiful democratic experiment didn't last very long. By 1823, which is just 5 years after opening its doors to everyone, the hospital hit a massive financial wall. They were carrying a debt that literally threatened to shut the whole thing down. And right at that critical moment, a Boston merchant named John McLean passed away and left a stunning bequest to the asylum.
Now, what's absolutely crucial about this is the amount. Almost $120,000. To put that into perspective, that was an absolutely astronomical sum back then. This money completely saved the hospital, and they were so grateful they renamed it the McLean Asylum for the Insane. But this money came with a subtle yet permanent shift in its identity. You see, wealthy donors expect a return on their investment. Because other public institutions were starting to open for people who couldn't pay, McLean became highly selective. It kicked off this long, quiet drift towards serving only those who could afford its very particular brand of mercy.
Section 1. Designing the beautiful asylum.
So as the hospital shifted to catering strictly to the wealthy, the physical environment really needed to reflect that exclusivity, especially since Boston's factories, slaughterhouses, and railroads were rapidly expanding and totally shattering the quiet of their original campus. They needed a new sanctuary. Enter Frederick Law Olmsted. This is the legendary landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York. In 1872, Olmsted pitches this brilliant vision for a healing community. He tells the trustees to buy 107 wooded acres out in Belmont, and his biggest argument? Do not build one massive, intimidating institutional block. Instead, he wanted village-like groupings of cottages scattered across the landscape. The idea was that nature and beauty would act as literal medicine. The trustees loved it, they bought the land, and then they quietly moved on without him, hiring a civil engineer named Joseph Curtis to just build it instead.
Which leads us to a truly devastating historical irony. At the very end of his life, Frederick Law Olmsted lost his mind. His family couldn't care for him anymore, so they brought him to McLean, to the exact same plot of land he had scouted for them. He arrives as a patient, looks around at the cottages and the paths that these other people had built, and he says this: "They didn't follow my plans, confound them." He had chosen this beautiful land to heal others, never ever intending it to be a cage for himself.
Section 2. When wealth became diagnosis.
By the time we get to the mid-20th century, the hospital's exclusivity had morphed it into something entirely different. It basically became a repository for the socially inconvenient. The Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Robert Lowell, who was actually a patient there himself, famously said the place was full of Mayflower screwballs. And that hits the nail on the head. Wealthy families were essentially using medical paperwork to quietly erase their embarrassing relatives without causing a public scandal. Got an heir with eccentricities that went just a bit too far, or a daughter with way too much unconventional ambition, boom, they were given a psychiatric diagnosis. Even two of the great philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson's own brothers spent time behind these walls. The paperwork called it clinical illness, but the reality, it was mostly just social inconvenience.
And nowhere, literally nowhere, was this more obvious than Upham Memorial Hall. This was the absolute crown jewel of the campus, a massive brick mansion built to house a grand total of 9 patients. It was so insanely exclusive that people just informally called it the Harvard Club. By the 1950s and 60s, it functioned as this luxurious warehouse for the elderly rich. Families would pay a massive lump sum up front for a guaranteed permanent bed. Now think about that incentive structure for a second. With a lifetime arrangement already paid in full, the institution had absolutely zero financial incentive to actually try and heal these people. Families paid to never see their relatives again, and for the most part, they never did.
Now, the really dark side of this social control becomes glaringly obvious when you look at the gender breakdown. Women arrived at McLean in highly disproportionate numbers, very often just for refusing to conform to the neat little lives laid out for them. Just look at this statistic from 1947. That year, 7% of McLean's patients were subjected to lobotomies, and every single one was a woman. These surgeries were incredibly lucrative for the hospital, and the patients, locked away behind those beautiful iron gates, had absolutely no say in the matter whatsoever.
Section 3. Leadership and Flawed Science. But right alongside this culture of wealthy confinement, McLean actually fostered some genuine scientific ambition. They were the very first psychiatric institution in America to set up a dedicated research lab. The problem, though, is that institutional prestige often acts as a smokescreen for incredibly dangerous arrogance, especially from the people at the top. Take Dr. Alfred Stanton. He becomes psychiatrist-in-chief in 1955. Stanton was absolutely convinced that strict Freudian psychoanalysis, the classic talking cure, could completely heal severe schizophrenia. He thought meds were a crutch. Actually, scratch that. He arrogantly outright refused to give medication to patients who desperately needed it. This ideological stubbornness led to severe undertreatment, ultimately causing 2 documented suicide crises at the hospital in the 1960s. He finally resigns in 1967, and get this, he spends the next 15 years rigorously studying his own methods, only to publish a study in 1985 that proved his own life's work completely wrong. The talking cure could not, in fact, heal severe psychosis.
Section 4. The famous inmates of the Golden Cage.
Despite all of this heavy history, or, hey, maybe because of this intense environment, McLean left a massive footprint on American culture. The list of brilliant, struggling minds who passed through its gates is just staggering, and so many of them used this space to push back against their confinement. Sylvia Plath survived a suicide attempt, stayed for 4 months, and used that exact experience to write her iconic novel, The Bell Jar. Robert Lowell wrote searing poetry about life inside the locked wards. John Nash, the brilliant mathematician, was actually successfully treated here with antipsychotics. Then you have a 17-year-old James Taylor. He earns his high school diploma there, writes songs, and get this, actually had the hospital staff escort him to the draft board so he could successfully use his patient status to dodge the Vietnam draft. No way, right? And Ray Charles? He avoided a prison sentence for drug possession by agreeing to check in, where he'd just play these impromptu piano concerts in Upham Hall. They used the only tools they had, language, music, art, to survive the Golden Cage.
Let's move ahead to the 1990s and see how this all builds to a breaking point, because eventually the financial reality of running this massive gilded estate finally caught up with them. Facing severe financial losses, the trustees had no choice but to sell off 80% of Frederick Law Olmsted's intended pastoral paradise. They literally carved the land up and sold it. The beautiful illusion visibly shrank. Which brings us right up to McLean today, and it's still a place of profound paradox. On one hand, it is absolutely a global leader in rigorous, life-saving psychiatric science. It's affiliated with Harvard, it's home to the largest brain tissue bank on planet Earth. But right alongside that world-class neuroscience sits the Pavilion, which is a modern, high-end, luxury clinical ward designed specifically for the ultra-wealthy. So the exclusivity, it never truly left. So why does all of this matter for us? Because both of these statements are absolutely true at the exact same time. It was founded on this sincere, genuinely radical desire to heal the broken-minded with dignity instead of chains. And yet, simultaneously, it evolved into a highly sophisticated machine of social control, a place where the wealthy could quietly erase their inconvenient relatives.
There is a lot of heavy history behind those beautiful Beaumont gates. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought, which is actually the very same question Robert Lowell pondered from inside those locked wards. Was this care or was this erasure? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on how architecture, wealth, and medicine intersect. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.